Namaste, I'm Mirza. I'm a mother, an advocate of the Sustainable Development Goals for the Secretary General of the United Nations, and a Goodwill Ambassador for the United Nations Environment Programme. I'm joined in conversation with the wonderful António Guterres, who is the Secretary General of the United Nations. We're going to be in conversation. I've been looking forward to having this conversation with you because we opened up questions to some of my followers on social media, so a lot of young people have sent in their questions. And of course, I have had the privilege of witnessing your work and witnessing how you're possibly one of the few leaders in the world who speaks as plainly as you do and as frankly as you do. And I thank you for your leadership. Am I free to ask you questions now?
Of course, but first of all, let me also thank you very much for the fantastic work you have been doing as an advocacy star, that has really managed to bring the concepts of equality, of justice, of development through your multiple activities and supporting the UN in an absolutely extraordinary way. So thank you very much for everything you are doing.
Thank you. Thank you. Should we start?
Yes, of course.
Okay. The climate crisis is evident. It's become more evident than ever before. The science has always, given us the evidence, but with the extreme events that we've been experiencing globally, there is really no room to question the science anymore. But still, we see a big gap between the understanding of the science and the action that follows through. Why do you think we're still struggling?
Well, first of all, because there are interests that do not want the climate agenda to go forward because that would be negative for those interests. If you look at many in the fossil fuel industry, they continue to double down in investments in exploration and not leading the transition for renewables. You see many other sectors in which the pollution is their profit margin. So there are many interests in society that are still oppose climate action. And on the other hand, let's be frank, each one of us, we sometimes also do not take care about our own carbon footprints.
Yes.
So we need to change our habits, we need to change the way we behave in many aspects. So on one hand, the negative interests in society that are powerful and try to avoid governments to take the right decisions because they would undermine their own profits or their own interests. And on the other hand, because sometimes all of us do not yet apply in our lives what we say that needs to be done.
I understand, but don't really understand this. And I think a lot of young people feel the same way too, which is what they've been saying of late. And in fact, in the recent few years, their voices have been so powerful and they've really been expressing this double moral, really, in the way the world is moving forward. Because at one hand, if we deny climate change and we deny the fact that we need to speed up action, then we are basically denying human beings the opportunity to live, to live with dignity, to live with peace, to have a future at all. And that gap, I think, is the one that we're all struggling to overcome, helping more people understand that it's all connected. The climate is connected to human well-being and life on Earth. We're at COP28. The first day was a landmark because we had this historic adoption of the Loss and Damage Fund, making it operational. It's given me a great sense of relief. How did it make you feel?
I was very happy to see that the fund is becoming operational. I was very unhappy to see the first contributions to the fund. This is not for a few millions or hundreds of millions. We are talking about the situation of people suffering enormously the consequences of climate change all over the world, but particularly in the developing countries that have not contributed at all to climate change. I think it's a good start for the COP that we have the loss and damage fund operational, but it is clear that in this COP we need to do much more. And we need to have a very clear commitment in relation to the phasing out of fossil fuels in an adequate time framework to be in line with 1.5 degrees. We need to take decisions to be able to triple renewables, to double energy efficiency, to bring clean energy to everybody by 2030. And this requires investments, but this requires adequate policies and strategies. And this requires, of course, fighting against many interests that do not like this to be done. We need also this COP to be the symbol of climate justice. And the situation today is extremely unfair. And the loss and damage is exactly the recognition of that unfairness. Look, Pakistan is a country that had very little contribution to climate change. The floods in Pakistan have been an absolutely horror. If you see the drought in the African continent, again, the African continent doesn't contribute to climate change, but the impact has been devastating in all regions in which life becomes impossible. If you see the floods, the forest fires everywhere, mostly in developing countries, you see that it would be necessary to mobilize much more funding for those countries to be able to invest in the resilience of their communities, in the resilience of their people. So there is this climate injustice that needs to be corrected. And this is the moment to do it here in the COP28. And for that, developed countries must must implement their commitments, namely the commitment to provide $100 billion per year for developing countries in climate action, to double the financing for adaptation. Adaptation means the investments necessary to build resilience of communities, and to, let us be clear, to make this loss and damage fund a serious fund, with the billions of dollars that are necessary to make it effective in supporting the communities that are dramatically impacted by climate change.
4 billion people have been impacted by climate change. That's, I mean...
Because climate change became the existential threat of our generation.
Exactly. You've recently been to Antarctica. I followed your trip there, and I followed your trip to Nepal as well. And you said something very important in your speech today, where you refer to the fact that even though these places are in two different parts of the world on our planet, they're experiencing a very rapid, change in climate with the glacier melt and the melting of the ice, and how that impacts everyone everywhere.
Well, starting by Antarctica. Antarctica and Greenland, because Greenland is also a huge ice mass over land. It's not just ice over water, it's Iceland over land. So when it melts, the sea level rises. Antarctica and Greenland are melting 3 times faster than in the 90s. And with melting ice, you have rising sea levels. And with rising sea levels, you have all the consequences that you can imagine for coastal areas. But Antarctica is also, because Antarctica was separated from South America, and when Antarctica got separated from South America, a lot of strong currents, the strongest currents that we have in the world are around Antarctica, and then they spread all over the world, and they are regulators of the climate all over the world. And they are slowing down, because the water is becoming warmer and becoming less salty. So this could have devastating consequences in relation to climate changes in different parts of the world. What happens in Antarctica doesn't stay in Antarctica, can be seen everywhere else. But in Nepal, I saw the glaciers retreating. These have now consequences in relation to floods, in relation to devastation of communities, because there is more water coming out of these glaciers. But as the glaciers retreat, one day there will be no more glacier to melt. And these glaciers are the glaciers that are feeding rivers like the Indus, the Ganges, and the Brahmaputra. Of course, there will be other sources of water, the monsoons, but this means these rivers will have in 10, 15 years less water.
They already have less
these
water.
Rivers are facing rising sea levels, and they have deltas that are very low. Millions and millions of people could be displaced in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh. So when we see the glaciers melting in the Himalayas, it's not only the Himalayas that are to be considered, it's all the impact in South Asia and all the devastating consequences that can happen. And so we must look into these clear signals of nature telling us, change your course, stop your madness, or we will strike back on you.
And we are striking back.
And we will lose. Yeah. I mean, nature, when nature strikes back, it can be devastating.
And it is. We're witnessing it everywhere.
It is
every
already
day.
devastating.
It's happening.
But the problem is that if we don't stop this evolution that we are witnessing, and of course, the reason why we are here in the COP is to stop it, and we have the technologies that allow us to stop it. Renewable energy is now much cheaper than fossil fuel energy. We have electric cars that are easy to produce. I mean, there are lots of things are changing. We can decarbonize much more quickly than in the past, so we can stop this madness. But if we don't, then, of course, the consequences will be absolutely devastating, because when we are destroying the planet strikes back.
Yeah. There's one question that has come in from social media followers, which is, how does the war impact the climate crisis?
Well, the wars impact climate change in different ways. There is first one dramatic impact with the horrible wars that we have seen in relation to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and now in relation to what's happening in Gaza. The attentions are diverted and people tend not to think about climate change anymore. And climate change is the existential threat of our generation. Yes. We cannot forget about climate change because there is a serious war in Ukraine or a serious war in Gaza. We need to address those wars and be concerned, especially with the humanitarian devastating impacts they can have, but we cannot forget that climate change is there and yes, it threatens us all. And
those vulnerable, made vulnerable by the war, are even more vulnerable because of the impacts of climate change.
That was the second thing I was going to say. The wars diminish the resilience of communities in relation to the negative impacts of climate change, and all the wars are also having climate impacts. No, you are burning fossil fuels in big quantities. You are exploding and bombs in big quantities. You are using equipments that are highly polluted. So the wars are in themselves. They destroy forests. Yes. The wars are in themselves a climate change accelerator. And of course, they cause an enormous suffering on people, and that is our main consideration.
What are the outcomes of COP28 that you are hoping for? And how do people who are on social media use their space to help with climate action?
Well, people that are in social media need to put pressure on their governments and need to denounce those that are an obstacle to climate action. Put pressure on governments to adopt the right policies and denounce the polluters that are contributing to climate change and need to be confronted with what they are doing. But on the other hand, when one looks at this COP, what can we get from the COP? First, it would be very important, this COP, to tell all governments very clearly, as a commitment, that in the next so-called national determined contributions, and the national determined contribution are the commitments that governments make in relation to climate action, and they are to be reviewed in 2025. The present ones would lead to an increase of temperature that would be much, much more than 1.5 degrees. So they need to be corrected. And they need to be aligned with the objective to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees until the end of the century. And there must be a clear orientation from the COP to all governments that they need to change their policies and to change their commitments and to change their objectives to align them with our objective, 1.5 degrees maximum increase of temperature. Second thing I believe this COP must do is to be clear in relation to the phase out of fossil fuels. Phase out of fossil fuels, naturally, with a time framework that corresponds to 1.5 degrees. Fossil fuels will not disappear tomorrow, but there needs to be a commitment to phase out at the right moment, with a roadmap to get there. And at the same time, to make all governments commit, as I mentioned already, to triple renewables, to double energy efficiency, and to bring clean energy to everybody. We still have millions and millions of people without electricity.
Yes.
The African continent, a large part of the population has no electricity. I mean, we need to bring energy to everybody, clean energy to everybody, because that is also essential for them to be able for their children to study, to be able for them to have their farms operational, to be able for them to have a normal life. So these are things that I would like to see coming out of this COP. Strong commitments in relation to the phase out of fossil fuels, in relation to renewables, to energy efficiency, and to bring energy to all. And then climate justice. We need much more justice in climate. First, those that suffer more are not those that pollute more. And second, the resources that are made available by developed countries to developing countries are far from what is needed in relation to the impacts of climate change that already exist and in relation to the investments that developing countries also must make to reduce emissions and to contribute to climate action. And this climate justice requires very drastic changes in the way financial resources are today distributed in the world. And we have a large number of countries that is highly indebted. They have no fiscal space to invest in climate. It's absolutely essential that they receive the solidarity of the developed countries at the same time that the multilateral development banks, the international banks, change their business model in order to be able to support them much more and to also, giving guarantees and through other instruments, bring much more private finance into developing countries at reasonable cost for climate action. If we can get these three things, clear commitment to make governments change their national determined contributions, to make those national determined contributions in line with 1.5 degree the next time they review them in 2025. Second, phase out of fossil fuels and big investment in renewables and in energy for all and in energy efficiency. Third, acceleration of what needs to be done for climate justice to be effective, and that means a lot more support to developing countries.
For adaptation and mitigation.
For adaptation and mitigation. But for adaptation in particular,
yes.
Because there has been much more support for mitigation, which
Not
means
enough
reduction
for
of emissions, than for the investment that are necessary for the people to be able to resist to the already existing impacts of climate change.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Do you have any questions for me?
Yes, I have.
Okay.
I mean, one of my questions is, in your work of advocacy, and you are advocating for climate, and you still have climate deniers, and you still have people in campaigns, do you feel that pressure? Are you attacked?
Oh, of
by...
course I'm attacked. I see a lot of hate.
Yes.
I'm attacked all the time.
You feel harassment?
Of course.
Oh.
It's very hard to be a climate advocate in the social media space. But while there is a lot of harassment, and yes, we are attacked, there is also an incredible rise in support. And I get so much strength by my interactions with young people, not just in India, but all over the world, who are not just understanding and adopting the science and educating and informing themselves, and of course using all of their strength and resources to educate and inform everyone else around them, but are also innovating and are leading the way with solutions. And that gives me a lot of strength. And I think that when you are so driven by purpose and you care so deeply about bringing change, and you understand, I mean, I always say this, now I only introduce myself as a mother first. The most urgent call for action in my life is to help inform people about climate. Because I think that this work of advocacy is so necessary, and it's so necessary for the health and the future of my children and our children. And so, yes, while the hate can be hurtful, most often now I ignore it because I focus on the good work that's happening and the fact that I've been able to build momentum, and I've been able to bring people together, and I've been able to, in my own small way, bring climate into the forefront of conversations in India and in some parts of the world.
I mean, you have millions of people that interact with you through social media. What are the key messages that you receive from them?
I think there is a lot of question about what is the lifestyle of aspiration, because there is a certain model that has existed, that has kind of everyone perceives as the ideal life, and what we're trying to build is the understanding that sustainable living is not necessarily highly consumptive. It is one where you start recognizing your patterns of consumption and understanding how you can use less and waste less and not be highly consumptive. And I think a lot of people question that, because most young people in many parts of the world perceive success or a good life as one that has, a highly consumptive way of living. So I think that's really the dichotomy that everybody is trying to deal with and overcome. Because if you look at, cinema, or you look at any mainstream storytelling, the aspirational life is one where people are flying jets and people are doing things that most people in the world can't afford and do. And I think it's that gap as well that young people are trying to understand. But they understand it so beautifully. So many of them have changed. I think it's the older generation that is very, very confused about what sustainable living would really mean, what does it truly entail, and what will be the way of doing business going forward. How can we truly make the shift that is necessary?
If you had the power in this COP to impose one decision of the COP, and that power would be implemented, what would you use your power for?
To action a complete phasing out of fossil fuels.
that would be a very good use of your power.
Well, we're idealists and we can only hope for the best. I want to end this with one last question.
Yes.
Given, the nature of your job and everything that you're exposed to every day, what gives you hope?
My hope is that I see the young people much less narrow-minded, much less nationalistic, much more cosmopolitan, with much more sense that they are also citizens of the world and not only of their country. And that gives me the expectation that the level of stupid conflicts that we are witnessing today, by the way, a male-dominated society, if there would be gender parity in the world today, we wouldn't have the wars that we are having.
Or the climate crisis.
Or climate change. So I see the young people much more open to gender parity, much more cosmopolitan, as I said, much less. So this is the main reason why I'm hopeful, because I know my generation has failed in relation to climate, as it has failed in relation to inequality, as it has failed in relation to many other aspects. But I think the new generation that are emerging will be able to correct that.
I hope they can, and I hope we give them the space and the time to be able to make everything that needs to be corrected. Because
probably they will not be given that space. They will have to take it.
I think that's the perfect note to end this conversation on. Thank you for joining us on Climate Conversation at COP28. Secretary General, it's always a pleasure and honor speaking with you. Thank you for your leadership, and thank you for saying it as it is always.
Thank you very much for everything you are doing for the good causes that we have in our planet and we have in humanity.